It's 3 in the morning. You're lying in bed, replaying a conversation from hours ago, or maybe days ago. But here's the thing. You're not actually remembering it. You're rewriting it. In your mind, you're saying all the things you didn't say. You're delivering the perfect comeback. You're articulating exactly what you meant instead of the fumbled half sentence that actually left your mouth. You're winning arguments that are already over. And somewhere in that parallel universe of your own creation, you're finally understood. Then you catch yourself, and you realize you've been awake for 20 minutes, mentally rehearsing the conversation that only exists inside your head. If you've ever done this, you're not broken. You're not overthinking in the way people casually suggest. You're engaging in something far more psychologically intricate and far more revealing about how your mind actually works. You're thinking in conversations you never have. And understanding why you do this is about to unlock something you've probably wondered about yourself for years. Welcome to the internal theater of the chronically introspective mind. Let's start with what's actually happening when you're lying in the dark, engaged in a dialogue no one else can hear. Your brain isn't malfunctioning. It's doing what it's designed to do: simulate. Neuroscientists call this mental time travel, but that's too clinical for what's really going on. What you're doing is running a psychological dress rehearsal. You're testing scenarios. You're exploring outcomes. You're practicing versions of yourself that exist only in the safety of your own mind. But there's a paradox here, isn't there? The conversations you think in are often more eloquent, more justified, more devastating, more perfect than anything you could actually say in real time. Why is that? Because in real conversations, you're dealing with the friction of reality. Someone else's unpredictable responses, the pressure of being present, the vulnerability of speaking something aloud and watching it land, or not land, on another person's face. In your head, though, you control every variable. You write every line. You decide how it ends. For some people, this is a minor habit, a 5-minute wind down before sleep. For others, it's a way of life. It's the difference between having a thought and living inside that thought for hours. The distinction matters because it points to something deeper about how certain minds are wired. There's a particular kind of person who thinks, in conversations, they never have. And they do it because they're terrified of being caught off guard. These are the individuals who, in real conversations, often pause before speaking. They choose their words carefully. They might even come across as measured or reserved, not because they're cold, but because they're running a microanalysis of what they're about to say before the words leave their mouth. In their phantom conversations, they're not pausing. They're fluid. They're sharp. They say the thing that needs to be said without hesitation. Why? Because perfectionists, and make no mistake, this is a perfectionist trait, don't actually fear conversation itself. They fear the specific humiliation of being inarticulate, of being misunderstood, of being perceived as less intelligent or less competent than they actually are. The gap between their internal complexity and their external expression terrifies them. So they rehearse, they practice. They run through the conversation until they've ironed out every possible wrinkle. Here's what's interesting. This rarely translates to actual improvement in real conversations. If anything, over-rehearsal creates a kind of psychological performance anxiety. You've practiced the script so many times that the real conversation feels like an audition. You're waiting for your cue. You're checking your delivery. And in that self-consciousness, you become exactly what you feared: inarticulate, hesitant, somehow less than the version of yourself that exists in your head. The hidden truth these people often miss is that the conversations in their head aren't actually better. They're just less interrupted. They're less human. Now, here's a different archetype entirely. Some people think in conversations they never have because they cannot, under any circumstances, tolerate unresolved conflict in real time. For them, the actual conversation, the one where two people sit face to face and work through tension, is so anxiety-inducing that they've learned to manage it through a kind of psychological proxy. So they have the argument in their head first. They anticipate every objection. They construct a bulletproof case. They imagine themselves calm, rational, righteous. And then, when they finally do have the real conversation, they're simultaneously present and absent. They're watching themselves from outside their own body. They're comparing the real dialogue to the phantom one. They're noticing all the ways the real person is failing to respond the way the imagined person did. This is exhausting, for them and for whoever they're talking to. What makes this particularly poignant is that conflict avoiders often don't realize they're actually having two conversations at once. The phantom conversation is actually the real one for them, the one where they feel safe, heard, and victorious. The actual conversation is just the messy aftermath, the thing they have to push through. But here's the psychological wrinkle. This strategy backfires consistently. Because the people in their lives are responding to the actual person, the one who seems distant, who isn't fully present, who seems to be arguing points that haven't been made yet. They're responding to someone who's already having the conversation somewhere else. There's another kind of person entirely who thinks in conversations they never have. And for them, it's not about rehearsal or conflict management. It's about processing. These are the people whose minds don't shut off. They're naturally inclined toward analysis, reflection, deep diving into the why of things. For them, phantom conversations are a way of thinking out loud. They're not rehearsing, they're exploring. They're bouncing ideas off an imaginary interlocutor, someone who listens, asks questions, and allows them to articulate something they haven't quite figured out yet. If you're this kind of person, you might notice that you actually need these conversations. They're not a quirk or a nervous habit. They're how your brain processes complexity. You're essentially having a dialogue with yourself through the lens of someone else. You're testing your own reasoning. You're looking for holes in your own logic. You're convincing yourself, or challenging yourself, or both at once. The interesting thing about this archetype is that they often feel guilty about it. They think something is wrong with them because they're not present, or they're lost in their head. But what they're actually doing is incredibly sophisticated cognitive work. They're not avoiding reality, they're preparing for it. They're integrating new information. They're making sense of confusing social dynamics or philosophical questions. The real issue only arises when this internal conversation becomes a substitute for the external one. When they stop trying to explain their thoughts to other people because they've already explained them, to themselves in their head, and the actual person in the room hasn't been part of that journey. Finally, there are those who think in conversations they never have because they're desperately seeking a version of a social interaction that feels safe. These are the socially anxious ones, not necessarily shy, but anxious. There's a difference. Shy people are quieter. Anxious people are loud inside their own heads. For them, the phantom conversation serves a very specific purpose. It's a form of reassurance. They imagine having a conversation in which they're liked, understood, accepted. They imagine saying something vulnerable and having it received with kindness. They imagine being fully known and fully loved anyway. In real conversations, they're often hyper alert. They're monitoring the other person's face. They're interpreting silence as rejection. They're preparing an exit strategy. They're already thinking about how they'll feel bad about themselves tomorrow. But in the phantom conversation, they're safe. They're enough. Someone gets them. This is poignant because it reveals something true about human psychology. Sometimes we think in conversations we never have because we need to believe those conversations are possible. We need to know in some cellular way that being truly understood is within the realm of feasibility, that there exists at least one version of human connection where we don't have to mask or edit or perform. Here's what ties all of these patterns together. Thinking in conversations you never have isn't a sign of dysfunction. It's a sign that you have an active, complex inner world. It's evidence that you're reflective enough to notice the gap between your internal experience and your external expression. It's proof that you care about precision, about connection, about being understood. But, and this is crucial, it's also a form of avoidance. And recognizing that isn't an accusation, it's a gift. Because once you understand why you're doing this, you have a choice. You can keep rehearsing in the safety of your own mind. Or you can start bringing some of that internal eloquence into the world. Not perfectly, not without friction, but authentically, in real time, with all its beautiful, terrifying unpredictability. The conversations you're having in your head are sophisticated and safe, but they're also incomplete. They're missing the other person's genuine surprise. They're missing the moments of real connection that only happen when two people are actually present. Not one person present, and another person already having the conversation somewhere else. So here's my question for you. What would change if you let one of those phantom conversations actually happen? Not the perfect version, the real one. Messy, unscripted, and somehow more true than anything you could rehearse. That's the conversation worth thinking about. If you found yourself in these pages, if you recognize yourself in one of these patterns, I'd genuinely love to hear which one resonated most. Drop a comment below. And if you want to explore more about how your mind works, how it protects you, and how it sometimes holds you back, subscribe. Because there's always another layer to understanding ourselves.